I'm Tiffany. I will be refuting Pablo's claims about how marijuana should be legal in all of the states of the United States. So the first thing Ronnie does is that he words his claim of fact as a claim of policy. And then following his secondary claims of why marijuana should be legal is marijuana has medical benefits for individuals who are diagnosed with certain illnesses, how legalization can have a positive impact on the American economy, and how legalization will lift restrictions on the research that scientists have been wanting to explore. So responding to the first secondary claim of how it benefits individuals with certain diseases, he mentions that it helps reduce the susceptibility of Alzheimer's disease, but I found a contradicting claim that a new study in the Journal of Alzheimer's Disease suggested that long-term use of marijuana actually increases the susceptibility of Alzheimer's disease because it reduces the blood flow to the hippocampus. So the hippocampus is involved in storing long-term memories, and that is the first region of your brain to shrink if you're diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. And then he also claims that it reduces the 50% of seizures in adults and children, in a study shown in NYU. But he also fails to mention the negative impacts it has on the adolescents. So the American Medical Association claimed that heavy cannabis use in adolescents causes persistent impairments in neurocognitive performance and IQ, and its use is associated with increased rates of anxiety, mood, and psychotic thought disorders. Moving on to his second claim of how it impacts the American economy. So like any drug, cannabis does impair like your physical and mental state. So CNBC reported that in a national roadside survey of weekend nighttime drivers, 8.6% of the people that they pulled over tested positive for marijuana. This is nearly 4 times the percentage of drivers with the blood alcohol concentration. And then they also reported that in a fatal car accident in Washington State, 12.7% of those that were in the hospital were tested positive for marijuana. They also reported that alcohol-related costs are more than 12 times the amount of total tax revenue collected. So it would cost more to make repairs against like the alcohol. Like what happens what happens in car accidents that dealt with like drunk drivers. So this can be correlated to how marijuana is also a drug, and how people will sometimes also smoke and drive. And responding to his third claim of how it will lift restrictions on research, he again fails to mention the negative effects that it has. So Dr. Drew Pinsky, who has been working with addicts for nearly 2 decades, claims that cannabis is addictive, and compared to cocaine and alcohol, cannabis is the most difficult to give up. I had a friend, actually a few friends, who got into using marijuana at a pretty young age there in high school. This was like 8 years ago, and they still continue to use it, but sometimes they try and wean off of it because they're so dependent on like the high that they get off of it. But they kind of quit cold turkey, and like the symptoms of it was pretty like bad. They were like temperamental. They couldn't really like focus on anything. They were agitated and fidgeted a lot. And then another study that contradicts his claim is that a new study that happened in 2016 at Northwestern University was found that marijuana users have abnormal brain structure and poor memory, and that chronic marijuana abuse may lead to brain changes resembling schizophrenia. So schizophrenia is a mental illness that interferes with the person's ability to think clearly, manage emotions, and make decisions, and relate to others, so like empathy. This is a problem because, it would cost more to like go to like their therapeutics and like psychiatric treatments and stuff like that. And that is my refutation of how marijuana should not be legal.
No, right. I think you're right that there's a policy argument at the basis here. One of the things that you can always do when there's a policy argument is present disadvantages, and I think you kind of have a semi-disadvantage on the second and the third points that you're presenting. The first point is definitely refutation on medical benefits, and you mentioned the two specific things that the advocate talks about. Alzheimer's, you've got a directly contradictory claim there. There's not really any analysis of what the advocate's evidence or reasoning was, but we do have a contradictory claim here and some evidence that leads us to the opposite conclusion. That's okay. The seizure issue, the answer that you have here has nothing to do with seizures. It instead talks about some other psychiatric disorders that might be developed, and that could easily fit into that third category instead of being on this point. Since you don't have a specific answer to the seizures point, I think one of the things that you might want to do is talk about whether or not their evidence demonstrates this. Was it convincing? Was it sufficient to arrive at those conclusions? Did it come from reliable sources? Use some of the presses that are available to you, even if you don't have a contradictory piece of evidence on this particular point. The second point basically just talks about the impact that it's going to have on people, and they're pretty, this is blood alcohol stuff versus the marijuana kind of thing. You're talking about the impact it's going to have on society for the most part here. The consequences to people who maybe aren't even consumers of marijuana. I think that's one of the things that gets ignored. If there are accidents, other people could be affected, not just the smokers themselves, but others could be, die in those accidents. And you've got some good statistical information that suggests that there is an impact here. You had a cost argument that you were trying to make. I thought your cost argument was a lot clearer when you got to the third point than when you were talking about it on the second point. On the second point, it didn't make much sense. But when you got to the third point, it basically comes down to, look, there are medical costs that are involved in people using marijuana, and those medical costs are more substantial than any benefit we would get there. The same thing is true on the second point. There are social costs that come from marijuana use, like accidents on the highway, and those costs are going to be outweighed by any benefit that we would get from taxation or reduced prisons or something like that. Of course, you don't have any numerical comparison on those cost issues. You just have the numerical comparison on the number of accidents that you have. Like I said, in the third point, I think that's a legitimate argument to talk about the risks of marijuana use and what the potential consequences could be. The advocate's talking about potential research on these points. I think one of the things you want to point out is there's been a lot of research on these points, and the research is not particularly positive. People tend to think, oh, marijuana is completely safe, but in fact, the research that has been done shows these specific effects. It's addictive. It has, Getting off of it is extremely difficult. It changes your brain function, and that creates a problem. It creates psychiatric disorders. That's that evidence that you had up above on the first point that I think would fit better here on the third point. All right, thank you.